a year or two ago on this general subject, and I thought it would be really interesting to get him to talk to us about it. And I'm really glad that he's agreed to do that today. He's working under Carolyn Stromberg at the University of Washington. He comes to us from Manitoba and Virginia. And his doctoral research is focusing on vegetation in the Pacific Northwest and how it's changed during a global warming event in Earth's past called the Middle Miocene climatic optimum, which happened about 17 million years ago. Today, though, he's going to give us a little bit broader overview of the evolution of plants and plant communities and how they've come to be today, highlighting the fossil evidence of that and giving us sort of a broad picture of it. He'll answer questions after the talk, so please put any questions you have in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen there, and then we will have that, and then after that's done, as Alan mentioned, we'll have kind of a meeting of the local group, and Alex and anyone else is certainly welcome to stay on for that as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Alex.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks so much, Jim and the chapter for inviting me out. We've been talking about this a while now, and we always had plans for me to come up to Bellingham. So it's nice, it is a shame to have to do this over the internet, but from a logistical standpoint, it does make all this a little bit easier. Thank you, everyone who's joined in right now. Pretty big crowd. That's awesome. I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't at least a little nervous, but we'll get through it. As Jim said, my name's Alex Lowe. I'm in the second year of my PhD, so I moved to Seattle about 2 years ago, as Jim said, from Manitoba. Did a master's there working with fossil plants. Before that, I did a bachelor's in geology at the University of Utah. So I've got more of a geology background than biology, but I've been learning a heck of a lot about plants in the last couple of years, so last few years. And then I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, so I sort of spanned a lot of the biomes that we will be talking about today. And so the title of this talk is The Evolution of Temperate Vegetation in North America. Obviously, that's a pretty broad scale topic, and because of that, we're going to be talking about some pretty big picture trends and things like that. So, I mean, you could make a whole career off any small part of this. So, we'll have time for Q&A at the end, and I'll probably, I may or may not be able to answer some of your questions there. I know there's a lot of people attending who know a lot about plants. Okay, let's get started. Temperate vegetation in North America. What do we even mean by temperate vegetation? So temperate is usually a word to describe a climate type, and it occurs within a particular latitudinal band today. We can see that illustrated here for the Northern Hemisphere. And you could kind of think of it simply as just areas that have pronounced temperature seasonality. And so warm summers, cold winters, sort of like that. So if we look at North America, we see three major biomes here. We've got the deciduous forests in the east, we've got the grasslands in the middle, and we got the conifer forests to the west. And these are the three major biomes that we're going to be talking about today. I'm really interested in talking about how those biomes came to be today. And so we'll be tracking those through time. But first, let's talk a little bit about them today. So let's start. Here's the deciduous forest in eastern North America. Here, winters are cold, cold enough that the growing seasons mainly restricted to the spring, summer, and fall seasons. And here, deciduous plants dominate, losing their leaves in the winter during that season. A little farther south, we see evergreen broadleaf trees start to become dominant as the growing season lengthens. In the north, conifers are more important as the winters get colder and colder. And we can even see that sort of gradient as we work up in elevation. As we move farther west, it gets drier and drier, and we sort of transition to these oak and hickory forests, often bore waterways. And then eventually transitioning to grasslands. So grasslands make up a huge part of North America. And a lot of that converted to agriculture. But here, grasses and other herbs thrive in pretty arid conditions because, at least in part, they allocate a lot of their resources to their roots rather than their above ground parts. And they have a pretty intimate relationship with fire, popping up quickly after fire. When we move from the east to the west, precipitation gets less, the composition of those grasslands change, and we eventually grade into sagebrush steppe, for example, in the west here. Of course, we have our own grasslands in eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, and California as well. And lastly, we have the great coniferous forests that we all know so well. Focusing here just on western Washington and Oregon, northwestern California. Here the summers are pretty dry and the temperatures are pretty mild, so you really limit photosynthetic potential during the growing season. That means deciduous trees aren't really able to make the carbon gains necessary to justify shedding their leaves in the winter. So evergreen conifers dominate here. Of course, we've got deciduous plants in a lot of the waterways where water is readily available. And even in the winter, we can have pretty mild temperatures. And so evergreen conifers can photosynthesize for many months of the year and form very highly productive forests, forming some of the biggest trees on our planet, like the sequoias and the redwoods pictured here. So here's a summary of the climatic conditions that characterize those three biomes. If we look on the right here, we can see many other biomes can be characterized simply just by looking at temperature and precipitation trends. We can kind of look across our planet and see how these relationships play out over space. But what about time? What about time? So how did these biomes come to be? How did we get here? And so I'm not about to get all Einstein on you right now, but everything we see today in the modern is really a limited set of examples about the way our planet can work. So if we look in the geologic past, so illustrated here, what we see are countless examples, additional examples of the way that our planet can work. And I think this perspective is really important when we think about the future. Because when we think about the future, we kind of have to imagine an environment that's not going to be like ones that we see today. So actually, just yesterday, I heard someone say this really succinctly. They said, how do we know where we're going if we don't know how we got here? And I think that's a really good point. So that's kind of the why, but here's the how. How do we study ancient vegetation? So we can study fossil wood. Here's a big old redwood stump from fluorescent fossil beds in Colorado, central Colorado. We can look at that wood under the microscope and learn all types of things. Second is a thing we call macrofossils. This is really any type of fossil you can see with your naked eye that's not wood. For example, leaves, fruits, flowers, other reproductive structures. And then, of course, making up some of the most beautiful fossils, in my opinion, that we see here. Pollen is a very useful ancient fossil plant type we can study. Its morphology reflects certain plant groups. Phytoliths, this is maybe something that people are less familiar with. These are microscopic silica deposits that form within plants. It's basically what gives grass their grit. And the morphology of these things is pretty indicative of different plant groups, like grasses, for example. And lastly, biomolecules. And so this talk is mostly going to focus on these types of fossil plants, macrofossils, pollen, and phytoliths. With a lot of these studies, what we aim to do is sort of paint a picture, reconstruct what the vegetation looked like at several points in time. I'm showing a lake here because lakes are pretty common environments that we preserve fossil plants in. You can imagine plant parts sort of working their way into this lake, sinking down to the bottom, getting buried in the mud, that getting more buried and buried over time, and eventually turning to rock. And that's what we dig through. But how do the plant parts get there? That's an important thing to consider in thinking about some of the limitations of our work. So the first thing I'll say is that macrofossils, things like leaves and this flower here, they're fairly delicate structures. And they don't usually travel very far from the tree from which they came. And they tend to be representative of the riparian trees and shrubs, so the things that are growing near the water. But often we're pretty interested in this vegetation that's growing way out here away from the water, because we know that riparian vegetation can sometimes be quite different in character than what's out here. So if we want to get a sense of that, what we want to look at are more microscopic remains. Microscopic so they can travel much farther, for example, by wind, or they can find their way into rivers or streams, which will eventually flow into this lake. And in my opinion, the best thing you can do is combine all three of these points of evidence to get the most complete picture possible. Okay, so with all that in mind, our story begins. The actors of our story will be broadleaf deciduous forests, grasslands, and coniferous forests. And look for those symbols throughout the talk so you know exactly what we're talking about. The stage the story will take place on is temperate North America, and the crops that will set that stage is climate and landscape. And when will this when will this story take place? Well, here's the geologic time scale. Moving up in time, the moderns up here. Just to give you a sense of where we're at, complex multicellular life evolves here in the Cambrian. Not long after, we have land plants evolving, forests emerging up here. And as we move into the Mesozoic, this is the time of the dinosaurs. And sometime in the Jurassic is when we think flowering plants evolve, as well as the cypress and pine families. And then our story, which is one of how the biomes I mentioned came to be, starts with really one of the most important precursors to that, which is the diversification of flowering plants. That happens here in the Cretaceous. And then our story will move through, we'll go through the extinction event here that killed off the dinosaurs, the non-avian dinosaurs. And then we'll move through several important climatic events in the Cenozoic. So, yeah. So I'm plotting that time scale down here at the bottom. You can see Cretaceous here and the modern over here. The Q is Quaternary, which makes up the Holocene and Pleistocene. And the width of these are actually proportional to the actual time that they represent. And this will be at the bottom through the entire talk. So feel free to look down and remind yourself where we are in time at any point in this talk. And our story is going to be anchored on a diagram I'm about to show you. This diagram shows global temperature changes over the past 66 million years. We've got actually a pretty good record of this, which might seem surprising. But this record comes from the seafloor, sediments that collect on the seafloor. You'll see this value here. That's the stable oxygen isotope ratio of little foraminiferous shells. I don't have time to go into that, but I'm happy to discuss it after. So don't even pay attention to these values. What we want to pay attention to is the relative trends. So here it is. Hotter up, colder down. We see in the Paleocene temperatures here rise into the Eocene, into this peak period of warmth, and then a general cooling trend from then until now. So we see all these bumps and wiggles throughout its course, and we'll discuss a lot of these. These are important climatic events that happen. You might notice that this diagram only starts at the Paleocene, and that's because that's where most of our ocean floor sediments We don't have much ocean floor sediments older than the Paleocene. And so I'll show you what I'll end up doing for the Cretaceous, but we'll use this as an anchor. You'll see it throughout the presentation. So this talk will be broken into 8 chapters, and we'll go through one by one. So, chapter 1, the diversification of flowering plants. Again, one of the first important precursors to modern biomes. So let's set the stage. These are reconstructions of what, for example, the globe looked like during that time. What I'll point out is India way down here hasn't yet collided with Asia to form the Himalayas. We've got a giant ocean through Europe. We've got a big seaway that cuts North America in half. And what you'll notice is no ice on any pole. So you can already see it's a globally warm world. Here's a view of North America. Towards the end of the Cretaceous, that seaway retracts out. And you can see that here. But what I really want to point out is you can see here that the Rocky Mountains are rising during this time. So we see that the Rocky Mountains are here. Appalachians over here on the East Coast, these rose quite a bit earlier, actually when Pangea came together. At this point, Pangea is breaking apart. But when Pangea came together, the Appalachians rose. And so you can almost imagine, this is, you know, about 66 million years ago. Those mountains have been eroding ever since. So they were higher back then, but not as high as the Rockies. I'll also point out that we've got connection to Asia and probably connection to Europe via these. We can do some island hopping here. Okay. So you'll see how I've handled Cretaceous here. I put a dashed line to sort of represent how I infer the climate from reading other people's works. And we have globally warm climates with a cooling event as we get to the end of the Cretaceous, which is the extinction event of the dinosaurs. Okay, so what about the vegetation? Again, the story here is rapid diversification of flowering plants. All modern orders of flowering plants arise in about 30 million years. Of course, that probably doesn't seem rapid to a lot of people, but if you think about the diversity that spans all of those orders, that's an incredible amount of diversity to evolve in this time compared to other types of plants in the evolution that we know about them. This is what Darwin referred to here as an abominable mystery. And there's a few ideas about what might have drove that diversification and the eventual, you know, dominance of flowering plants in our ecosystems. But, you know, I don't think we have that answered completely. But these are all modern plants. So what did the actual Cretaceous plants look like? So my guess is if you were walking around in a Cretaceous forest, you'd feel like you're in a pretty foreign land. These are all extinct genera. You probably wouldn't recognize a lot of these. We have extinct genera conifers in the uplands, and then a mixture of conifers, broadleaf, angiosperms, ginkgo relatives, and cycads in the lowlands. And the vegetation here doesn't really fit very nicely into our 3 biomes. But I want to highlight one thing, another thing that happened during this time that's important for the eventual establishment of our deciduous forest. And that's angiosperms evolved deciduous habit. It's thought that very early angiosperms and the angiosperm ancestor was evergreen. So sometime during this time period, deciduousness evolved within angiosperms. And people have hypothesized about the driver for that. Some have brought up seasonal drought. And actually some have brought up that deciduous evolved in the high latitudes in the Arctic in a response to winter darkness. But that is not well understood yet because of a pretty poor fossil record during this time period. Another important thing to consider here is the grass family has evolved in the Cretaceous. Poaceae is around. We have cool evidence here of that. This is phytoliths, grass phytoliths that were found in dinosaur poop. And this is work that my advisor did. So some cool evidence there of grasses, dinosaurs actually feeding on grasses. Okay, so in summary, so conifers were already pretty diverse by this time. As angiosperms diverse and grow in their ecological importance, they're sort of moving into these forests that are already dominated by conifers and cycads and other gymnosperms. Angiosperms evolved deciduousness and grasses evolved in the understory. So I should mention that, yeah, grasses first evolved in the understory of forests. Chapter 2, Extinction and a Complicated Recovery. So at the Cretaceous-Paleocene boundary is where we see a big extinction event that killed the non-avian dinosaurs and many, many other animals. Plants took a pretty big hit across this too, and we'll talk about that. And of course, this was in part due to the asteroid impact and maybe had something to do with that global cooling that I showed earlier as well. But this event definitely set the scene for the Paleocene that follows. So let's show you a view of the Paleocene. You'll see here India sort of still on its way up. No ice on the poles still. And that seaway's gone from North America. And where it left off, we actually have these pretty extensive, broad plains, lowland plains, where a lot of lowland swamps are forming. And this is where the US gets most of its coal from the Paleocene, from this time period. And these are all the swamps that are forming sort of in these lowlands left behind when the sea retracted. Here's the climate. A couple little cooling events in here, and then temperatures rise into the Eocene. So let's talk about the vegetation, and let's first talk about the extinction event. So here's a pretty good record that we have from North Dakota. This is just North Dakota. What I'm showing here is we're going up in time, so younger at the top. This gray bar is the extinction event. Each one of these bars is a different plant species and the range that we find them over time. And I mean, the pattern's pretty clear here, right? About 60% of species are going extinct at this boundary event, at least regionally. There's a chance they could just be going somewhere else, but we don't have evidence for a lot of these things popping up anywhere else. So at least some of these are actual extinctions. Exactly how many is hard to know. Okay, so that sets the scene for the Paleocene. Here's a map, a couple of Western US, or well, Western North America. A couple cities for reference. Each one of these two-letter boxes is an area that we find fossil plants during this time. What we see there is that floras tend to be fairly low diversity and regionally similar, so not too different from area to area. And sort of the traditional story here was that this is a recovery. This is kind of reflecting recovery from the extinction event. But actually, this trend extends for many millions of years beyond the extinction event. So maybe it's something a little bit more than just recovery here. Might have actually something to do with the sort of lowland swampy landscape. And these floras are dominated by these plant families you see here: cypress family, ginkgo, sycamore. This is the Katsura family. Katsura is a common ornamental that you see around Seattle, at least. Birch and the walnut family. So I'm going to show you some examples of members of those. Here you go, a member of each one of those families from the Paleocene. Of course, maybe many of y'all already know, Metasequoia has a very interesting story. Now native to only East Asia, had a very widespread range in Earth's history: Asia, Europe, North America. Actually known to Western science as a fossil before it was known as a living plant. Ginkgo has a somewhat similar story there. And then we see a lot of these other genera are extinct. Cyclocaria is not, but these other two are. But there are some exceptions to this idea of like low diversity, regionally homogeneous forests. And one of those exceptions is this Castle Rock flora from Colorado. You can see that it's located right here in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. What we see there, in contrast, is what looks like a temperate rainforest. Really common are these drip tips. These are these like attenuate leaf apices. They're really common in rainforests today. They're thought to be an adaptation for shedding, for the leaf to shed water. And we see a composition of a forest, these families, quite different from what I showed you earlier. And here's a reconstruction of what those forests I thought would look like. And you can even see here that that diversity might be influenced by this mountainous terrain here. And in the same respect, that mountainous terrain is probably causing a lot of rain in this area too. So in summary, in summary, many communities, low diversity, regionally homogeneous, though some exceptions, especially when we're not in the lowlands. Many extinct genera, and our 3 biomes are not yet distinct. Okay, global warming, much like our own. I want to point you to this blip here. This is a rapid global warming event known as the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. It's of particular interest because the rates of warming and the rates of carbon release that cause this warming is roughly similar to what we're experiencing today, at least in terms of how climatic events go in the geologic past. So it's really interesting time period to study to see how vegetation is responding to this global warming event. And one of the best records that we have of that is from Wyoming, from northern Wyoming in the Bighorn Basin. You can see that black square right here. And here that black square is blown up. All these black circles are different quarries that fossil plants have been taken out of. These are the Owl Creek Mountains right here. And what do we see here? So, on the left, it's a diagram similar to what I showed you before. The red is the PETM, the warming event. The yellow is the recovery, moving up in time. And each one of these things is a different plant species. And we see several different ways that plants are responding. Some plants just completely disappear, maybe going extinct or just somewhere we don't know where they went. Several other groups of plants are showing up during the extinction event, during the global warming event, and then disappearing after. And I've got some examples of those plants right here. Several species of legumes, this coryphoid palm, and this tropical family, Hernandiaceae. We got some plants that don't seem to mind. They're here through the whole thing. Some plants that pop up after, maybe new evolution of a new species, or maybe they're immigrants. But the majority of taxa here were there before, went somewhere else during the global warming event, likely to higher altitudes, higher latitudes, and then come back after. I think this is a really good example of showing that a common response of plants to environmental perturbations like this is to move, to track their habitat. And that'll come up a couple other times throughout this talk as well. So we'll keep that in mind. So moving on, I didn't think that deserved a summary. So, chapter 4, refuge in a greenhouse world. Now we're in the Eocene down here. Remember, you can always follow along down here. And you'll see why I say refuge. So again, here's a look at the globe. India just beginning to collide with Asia via these island arcs here. See the seaway in Europe, looks like it might be closing in a little bit. What I should point out, I didn't point out before, North America and South America are not directly connected, and they won't be for a while. And again, no ice on the poles. Here's a look at North America. Again, we can see those connections to Asia. We could see how we can make some connections to Europe via Greenland. And here's our temperature diagram. we see temperatures rising to this peak period of warmth. This is known as the early Eocene climatic optimum. It's the warmest that temperatures have been since flowering plants diversified, which means that this was the greatest expanse of tropical forests in Earth history, at least how we think about tropical forests today. And then cooling afterwards. And we've got some great examples of those really warm forests here in Washington. So here's a map of Western Washington. We see Seattle, Everett, and Bellingham up here. This gray here represents Eocene rocks known as the Chuckanut Formation. And maybe y'all have heard about this because they're pretty famous for their fossil palms. Here we see some giant fan palms. Here's one on display at Canyon Lake Community Forest. And these would have been dominant components of these subtropical forests, along with things like sassafras, swamp cypress, and tree ferns. But these subtropical forests are not one of our actors. And so that's where refuge comes in. But there's something really interesting here. If we just go a few 100 kilometers inland, what we see is this collection of fossil sites, all these open circles here. From northern Washington, the Republic Flora, maybe some of y'all have been to the Stone Rose Visitor Center. You can actually go dig fossils there. It's a pay to dig site. Spanning there all the way to central BC. And this collection of Eocene sites is known as the Okanagan Highlands. Highlands because these are volcanic mountain ranges. And these floras are very different in character to those near Bellingham because of that high elevation. So we can almost think of these as high elevation islands, temperate islands. And what we see here is a really important event happening in this, the eventual establishment of deciduous forests. And that's that we see major diversifications and broadleaf deciduous taxa. And you see the site right here, Maccabee. That's actually where I did my master's research. We published this paper here. This is actually the paper Jim mentioned that the Burke did a press release from, and that's how he kind of got word of our work. You see me digging fossils at the site right there. And one thing we suggest in this paper is that the high diversity of these forests and the high diversification rates that seem to be happening might be explained by the complex topography of the mountainous region. That's going to provide a lot of different niches, available niches. And interestingly, it's a very volcanically active environment. You see all these gray layers here? Those are all volcanic ashes. And it's the type of ash that makes really fertile soils. So these could have been really productive soils, and productivity is known to influence diversification rates there. So that's sort of an interesting thing. So now I'm going to show you some fossils from Maccabee. And these are going to start looking more and more familiar to you, maybe if you're familiar with Eastern deciduous forests at least. So here we go. Maccabee is actually the oldest occurrence of beech in the fossil record. And you can see a cupule of it here, along with a leaf. We see hazelnut. I can never remember hornbeam or hop hornbeam, one of those. Birch, leaves, and catkins. Alder, we got the female catkins here. Elm, I mean, we just find loads of these unwinged elm fruits. Maple samaras, and then probably something really closely related to Catsera, something in the family there. Also a lot of conifers. Here's Cunninghamia. This is a genus of conifer that you only find in East Asia today, at least native. Our cedar, firs, pines, and the most abundant conifer, again, is Metasequoia, probably because it's a riparian tree growing close to the water section. Okay, so we see these deciduous taxa finding refuge in high elevations. But what about high latitudes? That's another opportunity, right? And we just so happen to have a really great record of that as well. So we have a record of fossil plants from way the heck up here, Ellesmere Island, way high in the Canadian Arctic, next to Greenland. And those forests have been reconstructed as pretty taxodiaceous rich, so metasequoia, swamp cypress, things like that. Growing alongside broadleaf deciduous trees. You see this hippo-like animal hanging out in the swamps here. This is Coryphodon. And they even find alligator and crocodile fossils way up here during the Eocene. So really interesting time period. And here's a look at some of those broadleaf deciduous taxa. Probably a birch here, alder, probably a hawthorn, horse chestnut, and something in the group. So in summary, the Eocene sees the greatest expanse of tropical forests in Earth history. Broadleaf and conifer taxa diversify and sort of modernize in high altitudes and high latitudes. And I haven't talked much about grasses, but they're still hanging out in the understory, but during this time, they are also going over a pretty global expansion. So you find grasses all over the globe during the Eocene. But still understory plants. Okay, chapter 5, a leap towards modernization, moving to the Oligocene. So setting the stage, you see that India's fully collided or is fully colliding with Asia. The seaway is really starting to constrict in Europe. And perhaps most importantly, what's this down here? Sea ice, not sea ice, continental ice on Antarctica. The first time that we have significant ice at the pole. So that already tells you something about the climate, right? And then a look at North America. Okay, so here's the Oligocene. Again, we're coming from these really warm climates in the early Eocene. And then we're cooling, the globe's cooling. Imagine what's happening to those taxa that are diversifying in high latitudes, high altitudes. Well, their ranges are likely expanding. We see evidence for that. And then we have this really drastic cooling event right at the Eocene and Oligocene boundary. That's where that ice on Antarctica builds up. And so we're sort of setting up the climate that we described for broadleaf deciduous forests at the beginning, cold winters. And that's exactly what we see. Best highlighted by this flora here called the Bridge Creek flora. It's in central Washington here, central Oregon, part of the John Day fossil beds, if you've been out there. You can actually go on a hike. I went out here on my way moving out to Seattle, actually, and go to some of the outcrops that these early paleobotanists collected from. And here's a reconstruction of what those forests look like. And you can see the emphasis here on the fall colors, right? And that's because this marks probably the biggest first step in the development of broadleaf deciduous forests as we know them today. But what's interesting is we're seeing them in Oregon, not out east. Well, I won't say not out east, but we are seeing them in Oregon. That tells us something about the climatic conditions of Oregon, right? If we know the climatic conditions that are necessary for broadleaf deciduous forests to thrive, then that's obviously the conditions that we've got going on in Oregon during the Oligocene. Let's have a look at some of these plants. So you hopefully see here that, I mean, we've got an association of plants, again, really reminiscent of Eastern deciduous forests today and even deciduous forests in East Asia. And this is 33 million years ago. We've got things like pine cones here. Hop hornbeam or hornbeam, I can't remember. Terracaria, which is a genus in the walnut family, grows now only in East Asia. Maple, alder, another beech cupule here, mahonia, sweet gum. This is actually the bract of linden that the fruits and flowers come off of, if you've seen those. Hydrangea and hawthorn. So a big step here in the development of broadleaf deciduous forests. Okay, an important step also happening in coniferous forests. Here we have a record, the Creed flora from the Rocky Mountains. You can see the data here. These fossils actually got deposited in a collapsed caldera. So this is representing pretty high elevations in the Rocky Mountains during the Oligocene. And what do we see there? Well, we see floras dominated by juniper and pine, not too different than what we see there today. And even more of what we see there today are some of these shrubs, mountain ash, cinquefoils, currants, mountain mahogany, and mahonia here. So already in the Oligocene, 30 million years ago, high elevation Rocky Mountain floras are already looking pretty modern. So in summary, broadleaf deciduous forests in the Pacific Northwest already looking quite modern. Unfortunately, we don't have good fossil evidence from this time of what Eastern North America looked like. So I can't really show you that. Conifer forests in Rocky Mountains also looking quite modern. And we'll get to it, but grasses are just beginning to transition to open habitats. We'll talk about it in the Miocene. Okay, chapter 6, grasslands and lava dams. So two things I want to point out. The seaway in Europe really starting to constrict here. And ice on Antarctica has expanded, covering pretty much the entire continent now. And you can see North America, we still have these connections to Asia and potentially to Europe via some island hopping. Here's the climate of the Miocene. Sort of the most pronounced feature we see here is this global warming event in the middle Miocene. This is called the mid-Miocene climatic optimum. And then we have cooling that happens after that. Something else that's really interesting that happens in the middle Miocene is the eruption of the Columbia River basalts. Now, if you've been in Eastern Washington or Eastern Oregon, you must have seen all of this black lava rock here. I think this is Columbia River, maybe near the 90 Bridge. And this lava erupted from these dashed fissure vents right here and subsequently flowed over much of Oregon, Washington, a bit of Idaho. And they flowed much like lava flows in Hawaii today, as these sort of rivers. And that's because the lava is not very viscous. Enough lava flowed from the Columbia River basalts to bury the entire state of Washington 1 kilometer thick. That's over half a mile. So a lot of lava. And the eruption of these basalts and this global warming event potentially has some pretty profound impacts on the plant communities, right? But this is actually the topic of my dissertation that I'm studying right now. So I just want to make a quick plug right here. On the left here, you see 18 fossil sites that we're studying. Some before, during, and after the global warming event and the eruption of the basalts. So we have the opportunity to see how vegetation is responding. I visited quite a few of these sites. You can see boxed out in red here last summer, and some pictures from the summer out. One site I want to highlight in particular is Clarkia. This is a site in northern Idaho, south of Coeur d'Alene, north of Lewiston and Moscow. And I want to highlight it because the preservation here is phenomenal. You can tell the rock is so soft, I'm cutting it with a chainsaw here. And what you pull out of there, you split open a rock and you can sometimes see fall colors. You see greens and oranges and reds. You can actually remove the leaf itself from the rock matrix and store it as a leaf. And they've even potentially pulled DNA out of some of these leaves, which would be potentially the oldest DNA ever analyzed. So I'm going to show you a quick video highlighting the Clarkia site and some of the work of Bill Rember, who I was with this summer. So hopefully the audio and video is good for you here.
Hello, Bill.
Hi, Chris.
How you doing?
Just fine.
He was extracting a block of compression fossils from one of his pits when we arrived.
There's an
the
oak.
oak right there with green. See the green color?
Amazing. Yeah, I can see the green, dude. That's insane.
Dr. Rember is a geologist and paleobotanist at the University of Idaho. He's been working these sites since he was a graduate student and has since become the world's leading authority on the Clarkia fossil beds. Bill has developed a technique that breaks the bond between the leaf and the rock. Once he moves the treated specimen to a water bath, the leaf immediately begins to lift off the rock.
Oh my gosh. There's still a lot of green color there, too.
Yeah, there is.
He then coaxes the leaf onto a small screen, then onto acetate sheets so we can get a closer look.
There you are, Chris.
Gotta hold it.
So really fantastic preservation there. I want to show you some of the other taxa that we find in Clarkia. Here's a good example of that. Again, fairly reminiscent of a eastern deciduous forest or a forest in East Asia, for example. So with some western elements in here as well. So we got pine, swamp cypress, chalcedrus, the cedar here, chestnut, red oak, what we think is a tan oak here. Here we've actually lifted one of those tan oaks like you just saw in the video, cleaned it up a bit, mounted it on a microscope slide. And we're actually measuring the density of those fine ordered veins, because that'll tell us something about the photosynthetic capabilities of those leaves. So really interesting work. We got birch, this beautiful tulip poplar, greenbrier, true poplars, magnolias, sweet gums. So we can see the sort of continued dominance of this broadleaf deciduous biome in the Pacific Northwest during this time. And of course, that tells you something about the climatic conditions during this time. But for the Miocene, we actually do have a record back east. This is the Brandon lignite. Lignite's a type of coal. So these are plants that we find in coals, way up here in Vermont. And the types of plants we find here is your kind of usual cast of characters here for broadleaf deciduous plants. We got tupelo here, elms and linden. But mixed in with that, we have some broadleaf evergreens. For example, sweetleaf here, and Inglehardia and Gordonia, or some people call bay, I think. In addition, we've got these kind of exotic genera here that you only find in warm, temperate, and subtropical or tropical climates of today. So what we're seeing way up here in Vermont during the Miocene is more of a mixed deciduous evergreen broadleaf forest, you know, similar to maybe what we see in parts of Florida or Georgia today. So we still quite a bit warmer in the Miocene on the East Coast. Okay, what about conifer forests? So we've got a pretty unique opportunity to look at conifer forests, and that's at the Ginkgo Petrified Forest State Park. I'm sure that many of you all have heard of this and been to this. It's in Vantage in Washington, with a fantastic collection of fossil woods here. And the thing is that it's hard to get a good sense of higher elevation floras because high elevations often are not areas where you see sediments depositing. It's areas where you see stuff eroding. And deposition usually happens more in the lowlands. But we have a unique opportunity here, And that's because there was a volcanic mudslide, lahar, and I pictured an example of one here from Mount St. Helens, that happened in the Cascades and carried with it some woods from higher elevations. And some examples of that are Doug fir and spruce. So these are, of course, trees that are pretty characteristic of the Cascades today. Now, this is the first time I'm mentioning the Cascades. What we know is that, or what we have a fairly good idea about is the Cascades were around then, but they weren't high enough to create a big rain shadow. And that's, you know, I just showed you all these deciduous broadleaf forests in Western Washington, and they're in Western Oregon too. And so that tells you that a significant rain shadow hasn't developed by this time, but there was some volcanic mountains in the Cascades during this time. There was some elevation, just not as high as it is today. We'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so some idea about at least some of the taxa that we find in Cascades today that were there in the Miocene. Okay, and now we actually have a really interesting story to tell about grasslands, about the Great Plains grasslands. And a lot of this work is spearheaded by my advisor, Carolyn Stromberg at University of Washington. And so grasses leave pretty poor fossil records usually. I mean, the plants just sort of wither and die, and the leaves don't, you know, make it into areas where plants usually get preserved. And that's true for most herbs. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, that most of the fossils that we see are coming from trees and shrubs. Herbs are very highly underrepresented. But Caroline's actually fine-tuned a method that we can use to look at the evolution of grasslands, and that's using phytoliths. What she takes advantage of is the fact that, for example, open habitat grasses have distinct phytoliths. And plants that are typical of forests have distinct phytoliths. And you can use the relative proportions of these phytoliths and these phytoliths to try and understand when grass has expanded into grasslands. So I'll show you that data now. Here we go. So we got Oligocene, Miocene here. Couple areas, Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. And what these pie charts are representing, more black means more forest indicators, more white means more open habitat grasses. And we see this expansion of grasses right around the Oligocene-Miocene boundary. Unfortunately, we don't have the best time resolution to figure out exactly when it's happening. But I'll point out that these grasses are not like the grasslands of the Great Plains today, both in composition and structure. So they were likely more wooded than they are today, maybe looking something like this, the African savanna, sort of a woodland grassland mosaic. And grasses were dominated almost entirely by C3 grasses. C3 is a photosynthetic pathway. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But just important to note that these early grasslands looked a little bit differently. But some pretty major steps in the establishment of the grassland biome happening in the Miocene, the early Miocene. Okay, so in summary, broadleaf deciduous forests continue to dominate Pacific Northwest lowlands. Warm, temperate, mixed broadleaf deciduous / evergreen forest in Northeast US. We saw that flora from Vermont. Conifer forests in the Cascade Mountains, even if they weren't as high as they are today. And the Great Plains grasslands begin to establish during this time in these woodland grassland mosaics. Okay, moving right along, I'm going to take a quick water break. Hope you all are staying with me. I'm doing a lot of yapping up here. Okay, you can see we're almost at the end of our story here if you're following along at our timeline down here. Chapter 7, a last major step in modernization. So we talked about the Cascades. Let's talk about them again. So here's a modern view of the Cascades, and we see, of course, this significant rain shadow that develops over here. That rain shadow, from what we can tell, develops in the Pliocene during this time period. Also during this time period, the globe in general is cooling, and accompanying that cooling is is drying in many parts of the world. So cooling and drying happening just in general across the Pliocene, even without the development of the rain shadow. And we've got some really interesting fossil evidence that helps us understand when that rain shadow developed. So here we have 5 fossil sites, 2 from the late Miocene, 3 from the Pliocene, some on the west side of the range, some on the east side of the range. This will allow us to see, when we can get a signal here of that rain shadow. So let's start in the late Miocene. We've got 2 floras here as examples. We see a pretty continuously similar forest from east to west. Tupelo, swamp cypress, sweet gum. Actually, empress tree, I believe, is the common name. It's a common ornamental. Walnut, linden, things like that. So still looking like a broadleaf deciduous forest and pretty similar between west and east. What about the Pliocene? Sorry, I don't have pictures for you here, but west of the range, we've got a flora with oak, willow, elm, sweet gum, and maybe persimmon and redwood here. I think we're losing a bit of the diversity of broadleaf deciduous taxa in this flora, but still importantly, we've got things like sweet gum that can't really stand summer drought, for example. But to the west, the east of the range, liquid ambar and those other sort of water-dependent taxa here disappear. We wind up here with elm, oak, sycamore, and maple. I mean, these are pretty common plants of grassland riparian zones today. And then the pollen, which remember is going to tell us about vegetation beyond the riparian. We see Amaranthaceae, Poaceae, Asteraceae, Pinus. So looking probably more like a steppe environment. So this is highlighting the development of that rain shadow with, of course, important implications for all the floras east of the Cascade Range. So we've got an interesting flora actually from the east. Still kind of wondering, we're thinking about the development of eastern deciduous forests. So it's interesting to sort of look back east and see what's happening there. Here we've got a flora from Maryland. And what do we find there? We got oaks, hickories, swamp cypress, this interesting conifer here, sweet gum, and then some warm temperate evergreen taxa again here. So Miocene, during the Pliocene, looks like these eastern forests, even in Maryland, are looking like still a mix of deciduous, evergreen, broadleaf taxa, with conifers apparently not too important at this point. Okay, a really important thing happening in the grasslands during the Pliocene. So this is where we really see the modernization of the Great Plains grasslands in terms of structure and composition. On the right, we've got a graph that's showing the percent of C4 grasses in the Great Plains. C3 and C4 are 2 different photosynthetic pathways. You see examples of different types of grasses here that use those photosynthetic pathways. That pathway has important implications for the ecology of these grasses. And what we see on the graph here on the right, these values are various measures to estimate percent C4. And we see that they all rise in the late Miocene to early Pliocene. So C4 grasses are expanding. And what we know from the phytolith record is what is accompanying the expansion of C4 classes is the opening up of those habitats. We're moving from woodland, grassland mosaics to sort of the grasslands that we know in the Great Plains today, with very little tree cover, restricted to riparian zones. So Pliocene, in summary, the rain shadow begins to develop as the Cascades rise just a little bit higher. Warm, temperate, deciduous, and evergreen forests we see in east central US and Maryland. Conifer forests likely expand with the cooling and drying that we see in the Pliocene, though we don't have the best evidence for this. And C4 grasses expand as the Great Plains become more grass dominated and modern. So now moving to the very last chapter of our story, the Ice Ages, with the theme of on the move. Okay, we're almost there, bear with me here. So, the Quaternary marks the last 2 million years and is where we see the glacial interglacial cycles. What we see here is an example of a glacial period where these continental ice sheets form and expand pretty far south in North America, for example. When we look at climate, in this curve, it kind of looks like a mess, but it's so recent that we actually have much higher resolution records of this. So I'm going to show you that really quickly. Here I'm going to show you changes in temperature and changes in CO2 over the last 800,000 years. I put two frames of reference there when humans, Homo sapiens, evolved and when the agricultural revolution happened. And here's our cycles. Ice age, interglacial, glacial, interglacial. We can count 8 ice ages here. 800,000 years, that means one about every 100,000 years. CO2 sort of following the trend there of temperature, showing a tight linkage between CO2 and temperature. So these are pretty dramatic changes. Global temperatures from a glacial to an interglacial, those changes are about 6 degrees C. And that varies, of course, from region to region. So these are pretty pronounced changes. What is the vegetation doing? Well, the vegetation is moving. It's on the move. Here's a record of that just coming out of the last glacial, last ice age 12,000 years ago, moving into the modern. We see some colors here. These are different biomes. The orange is the deciduous forest and blue is the southeast forest. We see these pushed pretty far south 12,000 years ago. Interestingly, we see all this red. That's no analog. These are these communities of plants that we don't see in association today. An interesting mix of deciduous taxa and these conifers that are pretty typical of boreal forests. So that's interesting. And then we see as time goes on, deciduous and southeast forests sort of pushing farther north and what appears potentially farther west. Similar story here in the Pacific Northwest. This is a compilation of pollen from Western Washington. The blues are glacials, the white are interglacials. The area of these curves represent the abundance of pollen. And we've got pollen from, for example, pine, spruce, hemlock, so on. And all I want to point your eye towards here is that there's a lot of variation. There's peaks and troughs and ups and downs. And what that represents is taxa moving in and out of this area, away and towards this area. It highlights plants' ability to move through these climatic changes. So we come to an epilogue of sorts, sort of the end of our story here. And it was a lot. I know it was a lot. Thank you for bearing with me. But here's a sort of a summary of everything we talked about. I wanted to show you a lot of the details. But really just to summarize what we talked about, we got the extinction event here at the Cretaceous Paleocene boundary. We've got this kind of complex story of recovery. We got this warming event where we see some warming and drying in Wyoming, and plants are on the move. You see temperate taxa, temperate deciduous taxa diversifying in refuge, high volcanic mountains. Global temperatures cool, those deciduous taxa expand their ranges, and then drastic cooling event, we have the establishment of the first sort of modern deciduous forest. We see some pretty modern juniper pine forests in the Rocky Mountains. Our Great Plains grassland woodlands established. Move into the Miocene, Pacific Northwest, still dominated by deciduous forests, though it looks like we got some Doug fir and spruce in those Cascade Mountains. Grasslands open more here in the Miocene, Pliocene, and that rain shadow develops in the Pliocene, and then of course our ice ages. And so if I were to review this book and talk about what insight it might provide, you know, kind of circling back to the beginning of our story. How do we know where we're going if we don't know how we got here? I'd say some take-home points that I want to offer that I like to consider are: one, plants often track their habitat. That seems to be a very common response of plants when they're faced with environmental changes. Now that has important implications for today because we put all this stuff in the way, right? And so if plants kind of go-to is to move, but we're not letting them move easily, then what's going to happen? Because plants often track their habitat, niches can stay fairly conserved through time. And I mean niche in a fairly broad sense, but even 33 million years ago, when we're looking at the Bridge Creek flora, I mean, we see association of plants really similar to what we see in eastern deciduous forests today. That can be most simply explained by those plants occupying similar environmental conditions. We see novel plant communities. A lot of times these interesting mixes of conifers and deciduous trees. That's something important to think about. And I haven't talked a lot about a lot of the drivers that, so say, drove the diversification of flowering plants or the expansion of grasses. A lot of times that story is not always clear. What we think is the obvious driver for those evolutions is not always what we have evidence for. So that's something to keep in mind there. And so with that, I'll end this story and I'll just point out that though we're at the end of the story, there's still many pages to come in our book. And this information, a lot of it is on display at the brand new Burke Museum. So I really suggest that people check those exhibits out if you get the chance once everything opens back up. So thanks everyone again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. That was fantastic. Great talk. And I will second his advice to go to the New York Museum. I was there in February and it is fantastic. It's really great. If you haven't been there, you should definitely go check it out. Excellent. So a reminder on the Q&A, if you have any questions for Alex, go ahead and just type them in there. And I see we already have a couple, so I'm gonna start reading off. So we got a question. Okay, Mark Watron wants to know, was the 30 million year diversification of angiosperms all in the Cretaceous, or did it span the boundary into the Paleocene?
Yeah, that all happened in the Cretaceous. And that's kind of interesting because when we look at angiosperms, what a lot of the DNA evidence says is that angiosperms evolved in the Jurassic. You know, tens of millions of years prior to when we really see them as fossils. They show up in the fossil record. And so why that hiatus? There must have been some time where angiosperms evolved, but were, you know, not big on the scene. They weren't abundant nor in very diverse environments. And so all of that happens in the Cretaceous, just like you asked. Of course, some of these estimates vary, but a recent paper I was looking at had the vast majority, if not all, modern orders diversifying just in the Cretaceous.
Excellent. And Mark also asks, what is the age span of the Clarkia site?
Oh, good question. So the Clarkia beds, they're from about 15.5 million years ago. And those deposits represent an ancient lake. We think that a lake formed as lava came into a river valley, dammed a river, and then a sort of lake backfilled. And you get a pretty big stack of rock there. I mean, yeah, tens of meters. Well, what do we got? I'd probably say that there's two sites, and between those two sites, maybe like 50 to 100 feet of rock stacked up. But I don't know how long that really represented, because if it really was a lava dam, what we know about those lava dams is that they don't really last very long before they get breached. And so I'd imagine that that site probably, though it occurred 15.5 million years ago, probably only represents maybe thousands of years of time through the whole stack of rocks there.
Wow. Heidi Stenner asks, other than our infrastructure blocking the migration of plants, what other thoughts do you have for implications given today's climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, one important thing to consider, I think, is I brought up this idea of mountain refuges. As climates warm, things are going to move up in elevation and, you know, higher in latitudes. But when it comes to mountains, there's only but so much up you can go. And so you hit a point where, for example, the alpine vegetation up there, things that are not going to be able to track their habitat, because that habitat is going to be lost. It's just not going to be available to them at all. I think those are some really important things to think about. You know, can a plant track its habitat? What might be in the way of that? But is there even a habitat to track, or will it disappear? So that's definitely an important thing to think about too. Yeah, and oh man, there's probably all kinds of stuff too. Yeah, that's at least what comes to mind first.
Okay, great. And then a question from an anonymous attendee. When did the Metasequoia disappear from the Pacific Northwest?
Great question. In the Pliocene. So it was that time period. We see it everywhere in the Miocene. Sometime in the Pliocene, it disappears. And Pliocene, remembers, we see a lot of drying and cooling that happens during that time. Metasequoia is it's a riparian plant. It's pretty water dependent. I mean, we don't know so much about its ecology today because its range is so restricted that we don't have a lot of opportunity to see in all the different places it can grow. What's actually taught us a lot about the ecology of Metasequoia is cultivation. Is like, where can we grow it? And what we know from a lot of that is that it's a pretty water dependent plant. And so it didn't handle the drying that happened in the West. It didn't stay with the eastern deciduous forest for one reason or another. It's not there. I'm not sure why it's not there. Swamp cypress, taxodium's there. And so the only place it found refuge was in Eastern Asia. It was in Eastern Asia the whole time as well. So that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure why, but that's when we see it disappear from the Pacific Northwest.
And just a comment from Heidi. She says, thank you. Appreciate the high-level overview and huge thumbs up from another geologist for using your force for good. Heidi Stenner.
Yeah, thank you.
Katrina Poppy asks, can you expand a little more on the kinds of barriers to plant migration that you mentioned at the end of your talk?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all the things that humans have put in the way. So what I think about is farms, cities, roads, all of that land surface that is not dedicated to natural vegetation. And so when a dispersal unit, a seed or a fruit or something like that, I mean, that's how plants move, right? They don't have legs. So they need to move via these dispersal units. And if these fruits or these seeds land on pavement or land on a field that's being sprayed with herbicide, or they're just not going to be able to move. So it's all those human landscapes that I think about.
Yeah, I'll just add a question to that. What is your sense of the, thinking about fruit dispersal and how often that's birds and animals, the impact of loss of those populations, how much of an impact do you think that has on plants' ability to move around?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Plants today, so many plants today rely on animal dispersers, whether it's something they eat and poop out somewhere else, or something that sticks to their fur, or what have you. So I think that has really important implications for the plant's ability to move. In particular, one of the ways that plants move, I think, fast over long distances is from birds. Because birds will eat fruits and fly quite long distances. And so birds might be important factors for plants to move quickly, and and if climate's warming fast, they have to move quick and over long distances. So that's kind of interesting to think about, those animals that help plants do that. So yeah, like you say, definitely not a good thing.
Yeah, I wonder if plants that distribute through wind might be at a evolutionary advantage during this period. Maybe it's not enough of an effective matter. I don't know, but
yeah,
wonders.
Kind of, yeah. If the animals are not there to do it, then we might. But yeah, it's hard to say how much biodiversity we'll lose with the animals. Yeah.
Certainly, dandelions are doing well. So,
yeah, that's a testament to wind dispersal right there.
Annalise Burns asks, does the fossil record have any climatic change with similar rate as we are experiencing now? If so, how did plants' migration compare to their extinction?
I think probably the best example we have of that was that event I talked about earlier on, the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. I mean, it happened, I think it's most pertinent because, yeah, like you say, the rates of temperature increase, the rate of CO2 increase that cause those temperature increases are really rapid. Comparable to, they're not as fast as what we see today. And what we see today is over such a short time scale so far. It's hard to say, that warming happened over tens of thousands of years. It's hard to say if the rate we see now will keep up for thousands of years into the future. But that's the best example we've got. And what we see there is that plants are moving more than they're going extinct and more than they're evolving. The more common response of those plants is, again, to track their habitat.
Great. Well, that's all the questions currently. If anybody else has a question, please post it in the Q&A section.
Yeah, and I'll say real quick, I didn't include references with any of these because there was a lot. But if there's any of these works that interest you, feel free to reach out to me and I can provide you with some of the literature that supports that.
Alex, I'm curious, sort of, what's the next direction for your own research, given the work that you're doing now? Where are you planning to go with it in the future?
Oh yeah, we're just starting this big project. We got a big grant to fund it from National Science Foundation. And pretty surprising, they gave us all the money we asked for. And that's looking at this warming event in the middle Miocene, and also the eruption of these Columbia River basalts, which happened about the same time. And it's interesting that people have thought about, did the eruption of the Columbia River basalts cause the warming? And there's some questions there, certainly. What we're doing is we're kind of revisiting a bunch of fossil sites that have been studied quite a bit before. But a lot of these people just looked at the macrofossils, or they just looked at the pollen. And a lot of them, they don't have a really good idea of exactly how old they are. So our plan is to go to these 18 fossil sites that sort of span this climatic event, span the eruptions. And first, date the sites, and we'll do that using volcanic ash. We can find volcanic ash in the sediment, and we can use radioactive isotopes within that ash to get a really high resolution date. We can say that it's this old, plus or minus like 10,000 years. And then at each site, we want to look at macrofossils, pollen, and phytoliths. Because as I said really early on, combining all three of those points of evidence gives you the most comprehensive picture that you can have of regional vegetation. And so we're interested in painting that picture at these time points across these events to see how vegetation is responding. See how exactly it's responding. I mean, these examples are great because they're not models. They're actual examples of things that have happened. And they're incomplete examples. We got to put the pieces together. They're actual examples of things happening. And that's what we're sort of motivates us in this research that we're taking on now.
I'm curious if the diversification of flowering plants over the 30 million year period, which as you say is really a short period geologically, is that thought to be an example of punctuated equilibrium as sort of an evolutionary phenomenon, or is that, I'm just curious about that. I know that's somewhat controversial in some sort of circles, but.
Yeah, I'd say that's a good example of it. I think a lot of times when people talk about punctuated equilibria, usually they talk about shorter time scales, like a little more rapid evolution than taking place over. But I mean, relatively speaking, I'd say that this is an example of punctuated equilibria. And from my experience, I mean, I'm no expert on this at all. But from my experience, I've seen more examples of punctuated equilibria than I have some gradual change. Which makes sense to me, this whole idea, evolution of the survival of the freaks. You know?
All right. Well, that's all the questions it looks like we have. Let's see if there's anything on the chat. Fred Rose says this is a fantastic presentation. A lot of information spread over a well-constructed framework. A book in the making, he says.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think if there aren't any more questions, I guess we will conclude the presentation part of our program. Thanks again so much, Alex. It's really
you're welcome.
Great presentation. And as a reminder, this is going to go up, I think, Friday on the website. So for those of us, I guess everybody here saw it, but if you want to watch it again, or particularly if you think it's great and you want to let folks know who didn't get a chance to see it, you can refer them to the Washington Native Plant Society website. And I'm not exactly sure where those are archived, but I'm sure you could find them. Maybe Denise comment on that.
I could tell you, go to the homepage. We have a place listed there about virtual presentations. It is actually referred to as virtual events in our URL. Alex, thank you. I was very intrigued. It's excellent, and I will make efforts to get this posted by Friday. Thank you. And I will send you the URL to share with your colleagues, friends, family, loved ones, and all. Thank you.
Good. Yeah.
Alex, did you want to share any contact info for people who want to get more information?
Yeah, I can drop my email in the chat here.
Okay.
Yeah, I just put my, oh, let me change it to and attendees. There we go. I'll do it one more time here.
Will that be in the recording that Denise is doing? I guess it will be, yes.